The modern division between plants that are useful and plants that carry meaning is a relatively recent invention. For most of human history, these categories were the same thing. The herbs that went into cooking and medicine were the same plants placed on altars, carried into ceremonies, and cultivated outside homes for reasons that had as much to do with the invisible world as the visible one. Whether those reasons were spiritual, psychological, or simply the accumulated wisdom of cultures observing what happened to the people who lived near certain plants. The lines blur, and blurring them honestly is more interesting than pretending they were always clear. These 10 plants have been grown for positive energy across dozens of civilizations and thousands of years, and in almost every case, modern research has found something worth paying attention to in what ancient observers were describing. Lavender's relationship with human civilization is old enough that tracing its origins requires moving through multiple empires before arriving anywhere recognizable. The Romans incorporated it so thoroughly into daily life that the word itself derives from the Latin lavare, to wash, because lavender was the standard addition to public baths, private wash water, and the linens of anyone who could afford it. This wasn't purely about fragrance. Roman physicians understood, in the practical vocabulary available to them, that people who spent time near lavender were calmer, slept better, and recovered from illness more smoothly than those who didn't. And that observation was specific enough to make lavender one of the most deliberately cultivated plants across the Mediterranean world. Greek physicians documented similar effects centuries earlier, and Egyptian records reference lavender compounds in the preparation of mummies, a context that connected the plant with peace, transition, and the easing of whatever comes next. The modern research that has accumulated around lavender is unusually specific for an herbal plant. Scientists at the University of Vienna identified linalool and linalool acetate, 2 of lavender's primary aromatic compounds, as the active agents that reduce activity in the amygdala, the brain region that generates the stress and fear responses. This is not a vague effect. Inhaled lavender compounds produce measurable changes in brain activity that correspond to reduced anxiety and improved sleep onset in controlled trials. The ancient intuition that lavender made people calmer was not wrong. It was just describing, in the language available to it, something that turns out to have a precise neurochemical explanation. Growing lavender near a window, a door, or a sitting area recreates the passive exposure that Romans built into their most public spaces. And the effect is the same, regardless of whether the mechanism is understood. Lavender planted where its fragrance can be encountered daily is one of the most evidence-supported things a person can grow for its effect on the nervous system, and it has been doing exactly that for at least 2,000 years. Basil occupies a position in human spiritual history that its culinary reputation barely hints at. In India, where the variety known as Tulsi or holy basil has been cultivated for over 3,000 years, the plant is considered a direct manifestation of the divine, specifically of Vishnu, the preserver god whose qualities include protection, love, and the maintenance of cosmic order. Tulsi plants grow in the courtyard or entrance of traditional Hindu homes across the subcontinent, tended daily as a living altar. The ritual of watering the Tulsi plant is a morning practice that combines reverence with the practical observation that people who kept the plant close lived with less illness and stress. The word basil itself tells a different part of the story. It derives from the Greek basileus, meaning king, and ancient Greeks associated basil with royalty, divine favor, and prosperity. In West African and Caribbean spiritual traditions carried across the Atlantic and transformed by diaspora, basil appears in floor washes and cleansing preparations intended to attract fortunate outcomes and clear accumulated negative energy from a household. These traditions, Hindu, Greek, West African, developed independently on 3 continents and arrived at similar conclusions about the same plant, which is the kind of convergence worth taking seriously. Modern research has validated what these traditions intuited through a different lens. Tulsi is classified as an adaptogen, a substance that measurably helps the body regulate its stress response, and multiple clinical studies have documented its ability to reduce cortisol levels and improve markers of psychological well-being. The distinction between culinary basil and Tulsi matters here. They are different species with different chemical profiles. Growing Tulsi specifically, Ocimum tenuiflorum, rather than Ocimum basilicum, reproduces the plant that 3,000 years of tradition identified as the one with meaningful effects on the people who lived with it. A Tulsi plant grown near the entrance of a home is, across 3 continents and 3,000 years of independent observation, one of the most consistently recommended living objects a household can keep. Rosemary's association with memory is old enough to have been taken for granted by the time Shakespeare put it in Hamlet's mouth. The practice of Greek students wearing rosemary garlands during examinations wasn't superstition in the context of its time. It was applied knowledge based on generations of observation that people who worked near rosemary thought more clearly and retained information more reliably than those who didn't. Roman soldiers planted rosemary at grave sites not just as a gesture of sentiment, but as a declaration that the memory of the dead would persist. The plant chosen for this role because it was already understood as the plant most associated with the persistence of memory in the living. The research that has emerged around rosemary's aromatic compounds is specific enough to validate those ancient practices in terms that modern science accepts. A study published in Therapeutic Advances in Psychopharmacology measured blood plasma levels of 1,8-cineol, one of the primary volatile compounds in rosemary aroma, in participants who had been in a rosemary-scented room, then tested them on speed and accuracy of mental computations. The participants with higher 1,8-cineol levels in their blood performed measurably better on cognitive tests. The aromatic compound moved from the air into the bloodstream and produced a detectable effect on cognitive performance, which is precisely what Greek students were relying on when they put rosemary on their heads before exams. Growing rosemary near a workspace, a study area, or any location where sustained mental focus is needed recreates this effect passively and continuously. The plant doesn't need to be burned, extracted, or processed. It releases its aromatic compounds into the air around it constantly, particularly on warm days or when the leaves are lightly brushed in passing. Rosemary grown within breathing distance of where concentrated mental work happens is a 2,000-year-old productivity tool that modern neuroscience has validated more precisely than its original practitioners could have imagined. Mint's role in ancient hospitality reveals something about how pre-modern cultures understood the relationship between plants and human experience. When ancient Greeks and Romans strewed mint on floors and rubbed it onto tables before guests arrived, they were doing something more specific than making the room smell pleasant. They were using a plant they understood, through accumulated experience rather than chemistry, to shift the psychological state of everyone who entered the space toward alertness, openness, and good feeling. Mint was the ancient world's welcome mat precisely because its effect on the people who encountered it was reliable enough to make it the standard preparation for spaces where important social interactions were about to occur. The Greek mythological origin of mint, Minthe, a river nymph transformed into the plant by the goddess Persephone, frames the herb as a being preserved in a new form, which is the kind of story that ancient cultures told about plants they considered to have genuine presence rather than just physical utility. Ayurvedic medicine integrated mint into its framework for supporting prana, the life force that governs energy, clarity, and vitality, prescribing it for mental fog, low energy, and digestive disruption that was understood to cloud the mind as much as the body. The modern research on peppermint aroma has produced findings consistent enough across multiple studies to be taken seriously. Measurable improvements in alertness, working memory, and reaction time have been documented in participants exposed to peppermint scent, with effects strong enough to appear in driving simulation studies where reaction time has direct safety implications. The ancient intuition that mint sharpens the mind and opens the senses has turned out to be describing a real pharmacological effect in the language available at the time. Mint grown near an entrance, a kitchen window, or any space where alertness and good energy matter most is one of the oldest and best supported uses of a living plant for its effect on human psychology. Aloe vera's epithet in ancient Egypt, the plant of immortality, was not given casually. Egyptian culture attached that designation to objects and substances it considered to interact directly with the forces governing life, death, and renewal, and aloe appeared in that category alongside gold, lapis lazuli, and frankincense. Temple carvings depict aloe plants as offerings, and records of its use extend from wound treatment in soldiers to cosmetic preparations for royalty. Cleopatra is referenced in multiple ancient sources as using aloe gel as her primary skin treatment, a claim that modern dermatology has no reason to dispute given what is now understood about aloe's compounds. The story of Alexander the Great and the island of Socotra, that he diverted his military campaign to secure the island specifically for its aloe supply, on the advice of his teacher Aristotle, to treat the wounds of his soldiers, is documented in Greek historical sources and reflects how seriously the ancient Mediterranean world took the plant's healing properties. Ayurvedic medicine classifies aloe as a rasayana, a Sanskrit term for substances that promote longevity and rejuvenation at the deepest biological level, a category that also includes ashwagandha, turmeric, and a small number of other plants considered capable of supporting vitality rather than just treating specific symptoms. The chemistry behind aloe's reputation is genuinely complex. The gel contains over 200 active compounds, polysaccharides that support immune function, anthraquinones with antimicrobial and anti-inflammatory properties, vitamins, enzymes, and mineral compounds, making it among the most chemically rich substances produced by any commonly grown plant. Ancient cultures noticed that people who used aloe healed faster, aged more gracefully, and maintained vitality longer than those who didn't, and they described that observation using the vocabulary of immortality because that was the most accurate language available to them for something that extended productive life. Aloe vera grown in a home is not a decorative succulent that happens to be useful for burns. It is one of the most medicinally documented plants in human history, kept alive across 4,000 years of continuous cultivation because generation after generation found it worth keeping. Sage carries two distinct historical identities that are worth keeping separate to honor both of them. In Native American traditions across dozens of nations, from the coastal Chumash of California to the Lakota of the Great Plains, white sage has been central to purification ceremonies for thousands of years. The burning of sage bundles is a documented practice used to clear spaces before important ceremonies, to mark transitions between states, and to create the conditions in which prayer and healing work could be done. These traditions are specific, regional, and developed over millennia of practice within particular cultures and ecosystems. In Roman tradition, sage carried a completely different but equally serious significance. The Romans named it salvia, from salvare, to save, and placed it among the most medicinally respected plants in their pharmacopoeia. Medieval European herbalists carried that respect forward into a folk wisdom that said a house with a thriving sage plant indicated a prosperous household because a family that kept their sage alive clearly understood how to tend living things with appropriate care. The modern research on sage has produced one of the more striking findings in herbal medicine. Burning sage measurably reduces airborne bacteria in enclosed spaces. A study published in the Journal of Ethnopharmacology documented over 94% reduction in airborne bacterial populations 1 hour after burning sage in a room, with the space remaining significantly cleaner 24 hours later. Ancient cultures burning sage before important ceremonies were, in the most literal sense, creating cleaner air for the people in those spaces. Whether the mechanism was understood as spiritual purification or microbial reduction, the practical outcome was the same. Sage grown in a garden or kept in a pot near a doorway carries one of the most cross-culturally consistent associations with protection and household well-being of any plant in the human record. The lotus flower has earned its position at the center of Hindu and Buddhist visual and philosophical language through a biological fact that ancient observers found impossible to dismiss as coincidence. The lotus grows in muddy, still water, the least promising of all growing environments, and produces flowers of extraordinary purity that float clean and unblemished above the surface, untouched by the conditions that produced them. This is not metaphor layered onto biology. It is biology that ancient cultures recognized as a perfect visible model of a spiritual principle, that clarity, beauty, and awakening emerge from difficulty without being defined by it. The plant has been the primary symbol of spiritual development in both Hinduism and Buddhism for over 3,000 years because it demonstrated that principle daily in every pond where it grew. Egyptian use of the blue lotus operated in a different register. Archaeological and textual evidence suggests that the mildly psychoactive compounds in blue lotus, apomorphine and nuciferine, were intentionally used in religious ceremonies to facilitate the altered states associated with divine contact. The lotus appeared in tomb paintings, temple reliefs, and ceremonial objects across 3,000 years of Egyptian history, occupying a position not just as a symbol, but as a functional participant in ritual. Chinese cultivation of lotus extends back over 3,000 years as well, with every part of the plant integrated into food, medicine, and contemplative practice. The seeds, which can remain viable for over 1,000 years, lotus seeds recovered from a dry lake bed in China, germinated successfully after carbon dating, placed them at over 1,200 years old, represent to Chinese culture a form of persistence and renewal that transcends ordinary plant biology. The lotus is the one plant that appears at the symbolic center of multiple major world civilizations simultaneously, and the biological property that made it meaningful, emerging perfect from mud, is real, observable, and as striking today as it was 3,000 years ago. Jasmine's fragrance has carried cultural weight across more civilizations than almost any other plants, and the consistency of what those civilizations concluded about it is worth noting. In Hindu tradition, jasmine is associated with Vishnu and with divine love. It appears in temple offerings, ceremonial garlands, and the hair of women at weddings, connecting the fragrance to the moments in life considered most significant. In Persian poetry and garden design, jasmine appears as a symbol of the divine feminine and of the beauty that connects the earthly and the spiritual. Chinese emperors of the Song dynasty used jasmine-scented tea as a diplomatic gift, not arbitrarily, but because the fragrance was understood to communicate refinement, goodwill, and the capacity for beauty that a sophisticated culture valued in itself and wished to project to others. The research on jasmine fragrance has produced findings that explain why so many separate cultures arrived at similar conclusions. Compounds in jasmine, particularly methyl jasminate and related molecules, interact with GABA receptors in the brain, producing calming effects without sedation. These are the same receptors targeted by benzodiazepine medications used for anxiety, which suggests that ancient cultures associating jasmine with peace and the easing of troubled states were observing a real pharmacological effect expressed through the vocabulary of their particular tradition. Jasmine blooms primarily at night, releasing its most intense fragrance after dark, a behavior that made it particularly associated with dreams, the unconscious, and the form of insight that arrives during sleep. The practice of sleeping near jasmine, common in multiple South Asian and Middle Eastern traditions, may have been delivering measurable GABA receptor stimulation during the sleep period, improving sleep quality in ways that ancient observers noticed and attributed to the plant's divine nature. Jasmine grown near a bedroom window or a nighttime sitting area is one of the most cross-culturally validated plants for creating conditions associated with peace, rest, and the quality of mind that ancient traditions called divine connection. Bamboo's symbolic life across East Asian cultures is long enough and consistent enough to suggest that the people who cultivated it were responding to something genuinely present in the plant rather than projecting meaning onto an arbitrary object. Chinese, Japanese, and Korean traditions converge on the same set of qualities: resilience, flexibility, uprightness, and the ability to bend under pressure without breaking. And all of them found those qualities visible in bamboo's biology rather than imposed upon it. Bamboo does bend dramatically in wind and recover completely. It does grow with extraordinary speed from a stable underground root system that survives conditions that kill the above-ground growth. It does remain green through conditions that strip color from most other plants. Confucian scholars who planted bamboo outside study windows were using the plant as a daily visual reminder of the character virtues they considered worth cultivating, not because bamboo was a passive backdrop, but because it was an active demonstration of those virtues growing in real time. The feng shui application of bamboo, particularly the lucky bamboo arrangements that remain common in homes and businesses across East Asia and in diaspora communities globally, operates on the principle that living plants direct the flow of energy through a space, and that bamboo's upward growth pattern channels that energy in ways considered beneficial for health, prosperity, and clarity of purpose. Lucky bamboo arrangements follow specific principles of number and placement that have been codified over centuries of practice, with different numbers of stalks associated with different intended outcomes. The biology beneath the symbolism includes one fact significant enough to stand on its own. Bamboo produces approximately 35% more oxygen per unit of growing area than an equivalent stand of trees, making a bamboo planting one of the most meaningful contributions to air quality that a living plant can make in any environment. Bamboo grown with attention to its traditional principles is one of the few plants that carries an unbroken living tradition of cultivation for positive energy stretching back over 2,500 years across multiple major civilizations. Chamomile's elevation to divine status in ancient Egypt is a measure of how seriously that civilization took the relationship between plants and the forces governing well-being. Dedicating chamomile to Ra, the sun god, the most powerful figure in the Egyptian pantheon, was not a casual association. It reflected the observation that chamomile was among the most reliably effective healing plants available, particularly for the fever conditions that killed children, and that a plant capable of that level of intervention must be connected to something larger than ordinary botanical life. Anglo-Saxon herbalists operating in a completely different cultural context came to similarly elevated conclusions, listing chamomile among the 9 sacred herbs believed to protect against the forces causing illness and misfortune, a small category that placed it alongside plants like mugwort and plantain in the most protective tier of the herbal tradition. The German folk understanding captured in the phrase alles Zutrauen, capable of anything, reflects the same accumulated experience, a plant that people returned to consistently across centuries for conditions ranging from anxiety to digestive upset to skin inflammation, finding it useful enough each time to keep reaching for it. The research on chamomile's active compound apigenin has been specific enough to satisfy modern pharmacological standards. Apigenin binds to GABA-A receptors in the brain, the same pathway as several pharmaceutical anxiolytics, producing measurable reductions in anxiety and improvements in sleep quality in controlled trials. The ancient Egyptians treating children's fevers with chamomile, the Anglo-Saxon herbalists carrying it in their medicine pouches, and the German grandmother making chamomile tea for a sleepless grandchild were all working with the same biochemical mechanism expressed through entirely different cultural vocabularies. Chamomile grown at the edge of a garden path, where it releases its apple-scented fragrance when stepped on, delivers its documented calming effects passively and continuously, which is precisely how ancient cultures that walked through chamomile lawns experienced its benefits, without ever needing to name the mechanism. The thread connecting these 10 plants across thousands of years and dozens of cultures is not mysticism, though mysticism was often the language used to describe it. It is observation. Careful, repeated, multi-generational observation of what happened to people who lived near certain plants, tended them with attention, and allowed them to be present in the spaces where human life unfolded. Ancient cultures did not have the vocabulary of neurotransmitters or volatile aromatic compounds or GABA receptors, but they had something modern research is still working to replicate: centuries of watching the same plants interact with the same human nervous system and recording what they noticed. Grow these plants not because the ancients said to, but because the ancients noticed something real, and the evidence, examined honestly, suggests they were right. If this kind of content resonates, subscribing keeps you here for everything coming next. And if you want to go further, becoming a channel member unlocks loyalty badges and a growing library of videos available only to members. The link is right below.